Nu kan vi börja. Ja, men då så. Hur många har träffat Thomas Groome tidigare? Det var inte så många. Hur många har läst någon av hans böcker? Oh yes, do you understand Swedish? Yes, how many have read books of Thomas Groome? There's a lot of people. And articles and so on. So, and I hope you have prepared for this seminar. It's much easier to follow what Tom will say. So, you are very welcome. We are all so happy, and you can see so many people come here. You were in Växjö yesterday, full, so many people that could take there. Here is a little more people than we really could take in this room, but you see, they want to hear you. And I will stop you are welcome. You will go on this night in St. Eugenia, and tomorrow in Immanuelskyrkan. But don't think you can now come and yes, you can come to Eugenia. It's quite open. Perhaps it's possible to go to Immanuelskyrkan tomorrow. There are other larger rooms and so on, but it's full. A lot of people. 90 persons will come tomorrow to Immanuel. And the last day will be in Umeå. So, welcome and take over.
Thank you. That's on. Okay. Rune. Replace the batteries? Yeah? Anybody got batteries? I can use the hand mic until maybe we get the... Do I need a microphone? Yes. Okay, all right. Well, we'll replace the battery. Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. And thank you, Rune. Thank you. I can't believe that there's anybody who does not know Rune Larsson. Some people did not know you. He is very famous, and he has made me very famous. So I owe my fame to Rune Larsson. You would never have heard of me if it wasn't for my good friend Rune, who discovered me about 35 years ago. I had just made my confirmation at the time, right? 35 years? Yes. And Rune had made his confirmation too, and introduced me to all my wonderful friends in Sweden. So I'm very honored to be with you. I'm very happy to be with you. And I'm a little bit scared to be with you, a little bit worried. So let me tell you why I'm so honored. I'm always honored to have this kind of a day with your kind of people, because there's nothing that the church does in the world that's more important than how it educates and why it educates and what for it educates in faith. It's the lifeblood of the church. You may think of other important things the church does, celebration of Eucharist, for example, but there would be no community and there would be no Eucharist without good Christian religious education. So it's the very lifeblood of the church, and I think this is a serious question. Will there be faith? And I don't think we can inevitably presume the answer is yes. I wrote this book, as Rune points out, and when I first wrote it, an old friend of mine sent me an email, and she asked, "But Tom, why would you raise the question? Isn't it a lack of faith to raise the question? Didn't Jesus say he would be with us always? Didn't he promise that the gates of hell would never prevail against his church? So aren't you showing a lack of faith by asking the question?" Of course, I had a great response for her. I gave it back gently because I didn't want to diminish her, to put her down, but I wrote back, I said, "You're right. I never would have asked the question if Jesus himself hadn't asked it first." And of course he does. At the end of his life, in Luke's gospel, he says, "But when I come again, will there be faith? Will there be faith on earth?" So it's a very serious question. So I am honored to be able to address it and to be in conversation with you about it and to be companions with you in this marvelous ministry and terribly important work of religious education. So it's a great honor. Then I'm also delighted to be with you because I love coming to Sweden. This is my 4th time here over the years. I'm delighted to meet and happy to meet old friends like Rune. Irish High King Brian Boru rose up and led the Irish against the Vikings, and we won. He defeated the Vikings at the great Battle of Clontarf and drove them back to Scandinavia. So I'm here to say that after 1,000 years, I think we should become friends. I think we should sign a peace agreement and be at peace. We should put the past behind us. All in favor? Here you go. So finally, after 1,000 years, we're friends again. I'm joking, of course. So it's about time. 1,000 years. Isn't that enough? Yeah, 1,000 years enough. So, and I'm very disappointed to hear that the Vikings did not have horns on their helmets. I found that out yesterday, that they didn't have horns. I thought they had horns in their helmets. Why, I don't know, but they said somebody just painted them on there. But so that was disappointing. So, and what was the third? Yes, I'm a little bit scared. I'm a little bit scared, even though you're lovely, friendly people. But in many ways, I come as a stranger. I come from another context, another situation, another culture. I don't know your situation the way I could, the way I should. So I may not say the appropriate things. And sometimes, of course, strangers come in from the outside and they say very obvious things. They say things that everybody knew already, but because they come and say it with a strange accent, it sounds impressive and people hear it in a new way. So there's many biblical stories about strangers who come and who bring a gift. From the strangers who came to visit Abraham and Sarah, to tell them they would be the parents of a chosen people, to the stranger on the road to Emmaus. And we'll end with him this afternoon. So there's many biblical stories of strangers who come. So I come as a stranger, but hopefully bringing a gift as well. But if I say things that don't make any sense or that don't have any relevance here, just put it, say, well, he's from America. Well, from Ireland through America and so on. So I think we'll make it work. So I'm basically going to divide our time together into 4 parts. Will there be faith? But I want to approach the question by asking, first of all, well, where are we located? Now, that may sound like a very obvious question and somewhat perhaps even unnecessary to address it. But in fact, all of the great architects of Christian tradition, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, all of them said that the most effective, the required way to communicate our faith is according to the mode of the receiver. So in other words, we must know the people, the culture, the context in which we are working if we're to do this effectively. And Origen, writing way back in about the beginning of the 3rd century, one of the great fathers of the church, said that with culture, when it comes to culture, we really are like fish swimming in water. And as the old saying goes, the last people to discover water are the fish. Because they're swimming in it. In other words, we can be so ensconced in the culture that we don't even recognize it. And if we don't recognize it, and see what it is, we're not likely to respond appropriately. So it's important for us to know the contemporary cultural context. I can often say, oh, my favorite way of teaching is to lecture. Well, that may be fine, but the recent research, at least in the US of A, indicates that our young people, the students I teach in my university, have an attention span of about 6 to 8 minutes, which of course is the length of time between commercials on television. So if I go in and lecture for an hour and 45 minutes, for the last hour and 40 minutes, there's nobody listening. So in other words, we have to communicate according to the mode of the receiver. I'll spend a little time on that with answer where. Then I'll ask the question, what? What is the faith that we are to teach? And again, we can take that for granted, presume upon it as if we already know. But I think how the emphasis we give it, what we make central, what we leave as peripheral, makes a great deal of difference as to how effectively we might be heard in our contemporary context. Then I'll spend a little time talking about who's supposed to do it. And I think, again, we have to break open our imaginations around this question, because in many ways we've been lulled into a schooling paradigm. Now, I'm all in favor of schools. I work in a school. I love Sunday schools. I love whatever kind of schools. But we have to break our minds and our imaginations beyond the paradigm of schooling. And I will say why and how when we get there. And eventually then, if you stay to the bitter end of the day, I'll get to how. What's the best way to go about it? What's the most effective way to share this faith for our time? So, and basically, we'll spend about an hour on each one. So we'll break at about 11:15. No, 11 o'clock, we said. We'll break about 11. Then we'll come back about 11:15, go to 12:15, come back at 1:15, go to 2:15, and then come back at 2:30 and go to 3:30. Whew. That's it? All in favor? All right. It's the only thing I've prepared, so it's what we're going to do. Let me see if this works, because I like to wave my hands. Right? Let me see. Okay. On. Oh, okay. Testing, testing. No, testing. Testing.
Sorry, won't work.
It won't work.
No,
All right.
no,
Hey.
In 1 hour.
In 1 hour. There we go. No problem. No problem. What's with you? Okay, this works. This works. Testing, yes. Okay, let's go. The question of where. Where are we now? Well, let me put the question in focus for you. Let me start with a good pious sentiment. Our God is always faithful. I mean, the biblical word is a constant witness to that. The evidence of our tradition is a constant witness of that. God keeps God's side of the bargain, of the covenant. The problematic side, of course, is ours. We might be the ones who will fail to do this. And as I said earlier, even Jesus wondered at the end of his life, when the human one, that's the better translation, and the English translation is usually Son of Man, but in fact, the human one is a better translation of the original Greek, because it's an inclusive term. It's not a male, gender-specific term at all. When the human one comes again, will there be faith on earth? And I love the fact it's in Luke 18. So it's at the end of his public ministry in Luke's gospel, because Luke 19 is the entry into Jerusalem and Palm Sunday. Now, he still does a lot of teaching and preaching in Jerusalem in Luke's gospel. There's lots of gospel to come. But still, it's as if he's been rambling around the roads of Galilee for 3 years, perhaps, if you take John's chronology. And here now he's facing into Jerusalem, and it's this extraordinary line. It's like when he weeps at the death, at the grave of Lazarus. It's this amazing moment when he kind of stops and says, but when I come again, will there be faith? Will there be faith on earth? And as I said, in our contemporary world, for sure, we've probably never lived in a more difficult and more challenging time to do good religious education, to do good educating in faith. There's something about our era, the context of it, the culture of it, the whole environment of it, that is not that does not dispose toward faith, but in some ways and at times and significantly can dispose against faith. And our grandparents and great-grandparents never faced anything quite like it. Everybody talks about our secular age. and the challenges it has for faith on earth. And as I said, the challenges were probably never more challenging than they are now. I don't want to be discouraged by that, but nonetheless, it is tremendously difficult. There was a time when, and not so long ago, especially in our Western cultures, the default position in society was toward faith. Now, the default position is in alternatives to faith. And not always for bad reasons, or inimical reasons, or negative reasons. The Irish village that I grew up in, I could not have become anything other than a Catholic Christian, and an Irish Catholic Christian, because it was in the culture, it was in the air, in the language, in the everyday patterns. It was in the water, I think. Certainly in our mother's milk. It came by osmosis. It was the default position, was toward faith. Now that village is gone. So, and in many ways, all the villages are gone. There's no villages left anywhere. I'm exaggerating slightly, but I was in South Africa in May, a year ago, just from now. I was in a very traditional village, a very poor village, but they were all wired for Wi-Fi. And they were watching silly American soap operas of 50 years ago, Father Knows Best, and horrible things. And you wonder what it's doing to their psyche and in the midst of their poverty. But meanwhile, my point is the villages are gone in large part, and we've all been invaded in this secular age. Let me bring you into the conversation. I do this many times throughout the morning and throughout the afternoon. Take your pen and paper, and we're grateful to Rune for providing us with paper, and I think with pens. Rune, we penned yesterday in Vecchia. Justin Martyr, one of the first great apologists for Christian faith, and we'll come back to that because I think we need a new apologetic for Christian faith in our time. The old apologists were the ones who made the argument, who persuaded people into Christian faith. And Justin Martyr was one of the finest of the early Christian apologists, but he made the point that every culture has seeds of the gospel. That wherever we go to bring the word of God, in a sense, there are always seeds already there. In a sense, God is always ahead of us. God is always present ahead. The biblical image where God leads with the people of Israel, the pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night. But the cloud is always 2 days ahead of the people. So no matter where we go, or no matter what life you enter into, there is a deep sense in which God is already present there. And awaiting the planting and indeed the watering that the growth will require. But nonetheless, every culture has seeds of the gospel. So pause for a moment and just state the obvious, write it down. What would you see as some great seeds of the gospel in Swedish society today? Let me give you my prompt. I'll give you mine, and then I'm probably stealing yours. But I'm always amazed when I come here with the beautiful sense that Swedish people have of creation, of nature, of the environment. There's something deeply spiritual about that. And of course, the old psalmist says that even the rivers are clapping their hands and the mountains are singing God's praise. And there's something about your love, care for the environment that I see as a powerful seed of the gospel. I've probably stolen your favorite as well. Go to work. What occurs to you as seeds of the gospel in this great country? Write it down. And just take another moment. I'll put you talking to your neighbor in a moment. Don't quite get going yet. Every society has seeds of the gospel, but every culture, I think, has weeds as well. That's my word. Justin Martyr didn't come up with that one. What do you recognize as some of the weeds in this context and culture that easily choke the seed of God's word? What are some of the weeds? And of course, I'm echoing the parable of the sower. Well, let's go to the neighbor. Right now, we'll do this 5, 6, 7 times during the day. What I'm inviting you to do is to turn to a neighbor, any old neighbor, and if you don't feel like talking to your neighbor, don't bother. Just be willing to listen to the neighbor. Just 3 minutes, 4 minutes, introduce yourself, say hello, talk about the seeds and the weeds of the gospel in Swedish culture. Take another half a minute, then we come back together. Well, we'll come back together for a little while. When you're ready, finish your sentence. You'll be back with your neighbor again in about 20 minutes, so don't say everything the first time. Keep a little for the second time. But thank you for doing that so well. There's lots of wisdom among us. I'd love to hear from everybody. But give me a sense. Let's hear from a few people. What are some of the seeds of the word that are here in Swedish culture and society? Anybody volunteer? Is that a hand back there? No, you're just scratching, okay? Don't even scratch if you don't want to be called upon. Yourself.
We talked about three things. We talked about three things. One was the plurality of religion in Sweden. Today we just don't talk about secularity, but post-secularity, if you use the concept of Jürgen Habermas, that people today is not necessary in Christianity, but they are open to religion in a certain sense. And then we talked about your perspective about nature and ecological theology and the creation. You can use biblical terms and models for talking about ecological theology, that there is life and spirituality in the creation. And then we talked about, we talked about human rights. There is very much people today goes to university in Sweden and read and study human rights and ethical problems, and we think that's a sign of faith that we have to do something together.
Yeah. It's faith. It's faith in people. It's faith for people.
Yeah.
It's faith on behalf of. It's a witness to faith, that we would defend the rights.
Yes.
of people. Yeah. It's a witness to faith that we would defend the rights of people. And you see, we have great stories to tell as to why we should do that. Like this extraordinary story, the very first chapter of our Bible, saying that we're all made in the image and likeness of God. So we can have our spiritual rationale for doing what should be done and for doing what humankind would agree should be done by way of human rights and so on. But I think we're a little more likely to do it consistently and faithfully and with commitment if it's grounded in a deep spirituality. Philosophy can sustain people, but ideology can run thin, whereas theology and the rationale that this is what our God wants us to do can be a powerful motivation. Yeah, so they're great examples. It's interesting you mentioned Habermas. I want to tell a quick anecdote. Habermas is all back into religion. He thinks it's a great idea now. I wrote my doctoral dissertation. The three authors I drew upon were Habermas, Gutierrez, and Freire. I'm obviously dating myself. But when I read Habermas seriously, 35 years ago, he was totally opposed to religion. He was a neo-Marxist, and religion was just simply the ideology and the opium of the people and all the rest of it. And the best thing we could do, of course, was get rid of it. And then we had him at Boston College here last year, and I went along to hear him. And it was as if he'd done a flip-flop. He was all into religion. He thinks religion is marvelous. He thinks that society needs religion, that societies can't function well without religion. So purely as a sociologist, he wanted to bring back religion, a good religion, but nonetheless. He's got religion again, which I thought was fascinating. So maybe, and I think the point my friend here is making is maybe the postmodern, are we now postmodern? Maybe there is an openness to the spiritual. It does seem to have an openness to the spiritual and to the mystical in ways that modernity certainly did not. As far as modernity was concerned, religion was just the opiate. It was the superstition of your grandparents, and as soon as you got a bit of education, you would give up on it. So whether it was Freud or Marx or Nietzsche or any of the great critics, or even the modern atheists, the new atheists, as we call them in the States, Dawkins and Hitchens and these people are basically into this, well, it'll fade away. It'll fade away. But the postmodern attitude is to say, no, there's a deep spirituality out of which upon which we need to draw if we're to live humanly. That we're more likely to live, and of course we have our explanation of that. Again, we're made in the image and likeness of God, but postmodernity is recognizing that people need a spiritual resource in order to live humanly, and to live well and appropriately and with justice and with commitment to the rights of all people, and so on. That it's very difficult to mount that and maintain that and nurture young people in that without a spiritual resource. And postmodernity is coming to recognize that. So we may have a new day. Wonderful examples. Other examples of seeds you thought of, and I will try not to go on and on. Yourself. Do you want to use the microphone?
Sure. It's kind of in the same area as human rights, but the rise of, the real focus on equality, and it kind of belongs with the weeds, that there's a lot of racism growing, and then the anti-reaction is that many people react against it, and they say everybody is equally valuable, depending on your gender, your ethnicity, your sexuality. And people talk about solidarity in a way that they didn't 10 years ago. So that's really fascinating, I think.
It is. Because, you see, when you find that kind of a seed, there's all kinds of ways to nurture it, to affirm it, to water it with the Word of God. And it, if you go to this model, this figure of Jesus, then probably in human history there's never been a more radical person by way of inclusivity, by way of welcome, by way of hospitality, by way of favoring the last, the least, and the lost. Really, when you look at the contemporary historical Jesus literature, and it's a whole new industry now. There's more books coming out on the historical Jesus, who he was and what he stood for. I'm presently reading one by Gerhard Lofink, Jesus of Nazareth, what he wanted and who he was. And there's this fascinating historical research. Now, as you know from your own theological background, we've had many quests for the historical Jesus. I don't know what number we're in now. There was the third quest, the fourth quest. I think we're in the sixth or seventh. But it looks as if we're finally figuring out who this historical person was. We tried one more time. Thank you. You're very helpful. Oh, look at this. I think it's going to work. Can you hear me? Oh, fantastic. Good, because I like to wave my hands. But all of the historical Jesus research now are really pointing to this extraordinary witness that he was radical as hell, or as heaven, sorry. And it's Francis, his table fellowship, that the women, the children, the poor, the lame, the prostitutes. You see it in Mark's gospel. It's in Mark chapter 2, verse 7 or 8. And we always take Mark as the most historical of the four. So in other words, very early in his ministry, they started to object to who he's eating with. And then if you go about 10, 12 verses further, just the beginning of Mark chapter 3, they begin to plot to kill him. And in a sense, they have to kill him if he's not to turn their world upside down. And this emphasis on the poor and the hungry and the downtrodden and the rights of all, it's extraordinary stuff. There's never been a more radical witness to human rights in the history of the world than Jesus of Nazareth. And I don't think we're just being pious and sentimental and spiritual in saying that. The evidence is there. And as I said, this historical Jesus literature now establishes that very, very clearly in the context of the world of the time, in ways that we never recognized it before. And in some ways, our faith in him as the Christ of faith, which is terribly important, second person of the Blessed Trinity, the risen one, the Son of God, the divine presence in human history, that's all integral, essential, constitutive of our faith. And yet, in some ways, we allowed that almost to distract us from the radicality of his human witness. And instead of recognizing it as extraordinary, we said, well, he was the Son of God, so, wouldn't you expect that from the Son of God? No, he was a real human being in human history that lived this extraordinary value system. And, of course, invites disciples to go and do likewise. Powerful example. Let's take one more. Another seed. Let's say some of the weeds. Let's just do one old weed, okay? We don't want to dwell on the weeds. What are the weeds? What are some of the weeds you recognize? Somebody give us one. Yourself.
We talked about materialism.
Yeah, the materialism.
I heard this radio show yesterday called Tankesmedjan, like a satire show. And they played a recording from a man who was like, oh, it's an honor for me to be the first person in Sweden to sell this marvelous marble floor. And it was like, that was his success.
Yes.
He was the first one to sell this in an apartment in Sweden, which was the most expensive apartment ever sold in Sweden. So,
Wow.
and it was, for him, it was, oh, it's my success. And
Yes,
it's
yes.
perfect for me.
Yes. Great example. See, when you look at the weeds, whatever you wrote down as weeds, when you look at them carefully, you'll recognize that every one of them is some form of idolatry. Every one of them will be putting something, material good, success, whatever, fame, fortune, power, pleasure. Every weed will be some version of an idolatry, which of course is why God made the first commandment first. And when you look at it, you know, it's when we teach the 10 Commandments as religious educators, we often make the mistake of starting with Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. Verse 1 is just an introduction, just a kind of an empty line. But if we start with Exodus chapter 20, verse 3, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have other gods besides me. But we leave out the crucial line, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, that place of slavery. Now, put me at the center of your life. Have no other gods but me. And it's as if God, Yahweh God, is saying to the people, look, I've taken you out of slavery. If you want to remain free, then you've got to put me at the center of your life, because a God of freedom will maintain your freedom. Anything else, any idol, fame, fortune, power, pleasure, whatever you put there, will enslave you. You'll be back in Egypt again before you know it. And everything other than the God of freedom and the God of liberation, this God who intervenes in human history to set free the oppressed and the slave, and who wants freedom for every one of us, who longs in God's heart that we be free. And then you can pile on Jesus saying, freedom is what you have. Christ has set you free. Paul saying, Galatians 5:1. Stand then as free people. Do not become slaves again. So much of our brokenness and so much of our failure and our sins, I suppose, in our time, are sins against the first commandment. And of course, then it becomes destructive. When we put idols there, they will terrify us, terrorize us, hold us captive, hold us addicted, or whatever it might be. So getting people to put God first in their lives is a marvelous source of liberation, of freedom. Rather than, you have to follow the laws of God, and if you do, maybe you get to heaven. This is how the church preached it. If you don't obey those commandments, you'll go to hell. Whereas if you do obey them, you might get to heaven. Yeah, that's it. But that apologetic won't work anymore. That trick or treat, threat or treat, I suppose, with the threat of hell and the promise of heaven. This age won't be persuasive. Long since ceased to be persuasive. But we are capable of mounting a better persuasion. And we need a new apologetic for this faith of ours. And it has to be one of persuasion. It can't be one of coercion or by authority. You have to believe it. Why? Well, it's in the Bible. That's why. Or in my tradition, we said, well, the church said so. Because God gave it to Jesus. Jesus gave it to the church. Now the church is giving it to you. Why could you question it? I mean, you have to believe it. But won't work. Won't work anymore. Yeah. Let me push on a little bit. Weeds galore, indeed. But anyway, now we're already post-secular, but let me summarize this very briefly. Ours is a secular age. Charles Taylor, one of the great Christian intellectuals, really, of the contemporary world, was a retired professor at McMaster University, laid out a very spectacular analysis of the secular age in a book called The Secular Age. And he says there's three different meanings of secularization, or of the becoming a secular society. One is the separating of church and state, and that's a blessing. That's a blessing of the secular age, I think. And we're better off with the political powers and the religious powers being separated. Now, I know that's an evolutionary question or issue here in Sweden, but I'm glad you're moving in the right direction. I think if you don't practice, you won't believe for very long. We think this is a matter of you have beliefs, and maybe you practice them, but really, I think it's the other way around. If you practice them, I think you'll probably have beliefs. John chapter 8, I'm proof texting a little. John chapter 8, verse 31, he says, if you live according to my teachings, you're truly my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. You see, if he was a good if he was a good Greek philosopher, he would have said, if you know the truth, you'll become a disciple and you'll go live it. But in fact, Jesus, in typical Hebrew fashion, said, if you live it, you'll become it and you'll know it in ways that will set you free. So I think the practices, getting people to show up on a Sunday, taking kids to church, is a powerful way to teach the faith. There's a story told in the States of, one of my favorite stories, of a young woman who had an audition at Carnegie Hall, the great concert center, as a violinist in New York. And Carnegie Hall is up on 58th and 7th in New York, downtown Manhattan. So she gets off the subway, and she's somewhat disoriented, doesn't know which way to walk. And she has her violin under her arm going to her audition, and she sees an old gentleman coming along with a violin under his arm. So she just presumes that he would know where Carnegie Hall is and which direction to walk. And she excused herself and said, excuse me, sir, how do I get to Carnegie Hall? And he looked at her and he said, practice, practice, practice. Now, I think Christian faith is the very same. My great mentor, pedagogically, as many of you know, is Paulo Freire. I was very blessed to meet him when I was a doctoral student at Union Theological Seminary in New York, a great Protestant seminary that I went to great by choice because I wanted to be exposed to a broader tradition than my own, much as I cherish my own. And I was fortunate to meet Freire there, and he and I became good friends, and we taught together 2 or 3 different occasions at Boston College. But if you said to Freire, how do you raise Christians? He would say, give them Christian things to do. It arises from the praxis, not just from the theoria. Now, the theory is important, but the praxis, get them to do Christian things. So the falling off of religious practice is ominous. And we have to somehow, and we'll come back to this by the afternoon, getting young people to do good Christian things, the kind of works of justice, works of compassion, works of outreach and inclusion, works of hospitality, works creation for the environment. There are powerful ways to nurture people in faith, to educate in faith. So it's not as if you believe it and then you put it into practice. Getting them to put it into practice may be the best way to get them to believe it, in the sense of knowing it in the deep heart's core of their lives, etc. Now, but Taylor would say that the third meaning of the secular, or secularization, is the most challenging of all. And in many ways, the most difficult for us to address, but we must address it. And he says that basically the third meaning of secularization is that the conditions of society have changed, so that they are no longer disposing people toward faith. In fact, in many ways, they're marginalizing faith. They're setting faith to the edge or to the corner and maybe right off the page. And they're very often proposing very viable alternatives. He calls the favorite alternative exclusive humanism. And he uses the word exclusive in the sense of excluding any sense or referent to the transcendent, to God, to the divine. It's a humanism you can do by yourself. People can get along very well in this society without religion. And thousands and millions of our people do. And in some ways appear to be living healthier, more fruitful, more rewarding, perhaps more integrated lives than those of us who are still going to church. There's a very viable humanism available in the postmodern world. And lots of people are embracing it. And it's not for bad reasons. Not all. Some of them are poor reasons, but some of them are good reasons. Medical science, for example, has marginalized faith in very significant ways. Now, let me tell a personal story. When I was about 4 years old, I developed pneumonia. And I lived on a farm in the middle of Ireland, about 10 miles from the nearest town that had a doctor. My mother was home alone. My father was a politician. He was in Dublin. I was the youngest of 9 children. They had already lost a little daughter, an older sister of mine. I never met her. They had already lost her to pneumonia. It was a winter's night, and a child with a high fever, there was no point in trying to harness a horse and buggy to get to the village, probably killed the kid with the cold of a winter's night. So pneumonia on an Irish farm on a winter's night 60 years ago was a very serious crisis. So what did she do? Her first instinct, and this is how she told the story, was to drop to her knees beside my bed, and she told God that she wasn't leaving there. First of all, she gave God a bit of her mind. And then she told God that she wasn't leaving there until my fever broke. I fell asleep, she fell asleep. We both woke up, and my fever had broken. Now, she went to her grave swearing that that was a miracle. I've never decided. Maybe it was. The point I want to make is her granddaughters would never do that. Do you know what they'd do instead? They'd pop the kid in the SUV, and they'd be in the village in 10 minutes, and the kid would get a course of penicillin or antibiotic and would be running around in a couple of days. So who needs God if you've got a good doctor close by? So the point is, we don't have the felt need for God the way our grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever, might have had. And you can think of all of the other examples yourself. In that Irish village of mine, we talked about the weather and God all the time. We put the two together. Because you say, it's a grand day, thank God. Or, oh, with the help of God, we'll have a fine day tomorrow. Or with the help of God, we'll have some rain tomorrow. That prayer was nearly always answered, by the way, in Ireland. We put God and the weather together all the time. You know what? Now they still talk about the weather, but they don't include God. You know why? Because they turn on the weather channel, and they get the weather for the next 7 days, no matter what God says. So God is gone, even from the Irish talking about the weather. And you can think of umpteen examples in your life, in your context, and they're not bad reasons. But in a sense, we don't need God nearly as much as the way we used to. This exclusive humanism. And then when you add in, and Taylor makes a big point of this, he says that something extraordinary, I want to say this very briefly, has happened to our consciousness, that we've basically shifted from a cosmos to a universe. And the cosmos was somewhat manageable. We had a little world that we held and put together for ourselves. There was earth down here, there was heaven up there, and we talked about people going up to heaven and down to hell, and we knew that where we stood. We had a little world, and there was a moon and a sun, and there were stars we could see far away in God's firmament that God put there for our edification or beautification or something, but it was all very manageable. And you could think in terms of a cosmos. But now, says Taylor, where our consciousness is broken out into this universe. And this universe is like, we can't begin to think it. There was a quasar that passed us by last year, and the scientists estimated that it had been traveling toward us at 80,000 miles a second, or I forget the speed of light, for about 13 billion years. Now, how they estimate that, I don't know. But our galaxy, that this Milky Way galaxy is only a small little galaxy among millions and millions of other galaxies and billions of other planets. And you begin to think, oh my God. Well, you can't think infinity. And even if you can think your way to the furthest star, the furthest planet, then you say, and I wonder what's the far side of that? A wall? A dead end? But what's the far side of the dead end? We can't think infinity. We can't think God. So people say, they set it aside. It was more manageable one time. And then Christians come up with crazy claims that say that, and this God that created all of this all this infinity, loves you knows you by name, knit you together in your mother's womb, made you fearfully, wonderfully. Psalm 139, called you by name, I called you by name, you're mine. And then Christians claim that we can talk to this God, and that this God, we call it prayer, listens, hears, responds in the depths of our own hearts. And then the ultimate craziness of Christian faith is we claim that this God became one of ourselves in this Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I mean, you can't blame people for walking away from that kind of craziness. How could you believe that? Really? So, it's a different world. And this is Taylor's point. We've shifted from a cosmos to a universe. And we can't think universe, so we don't think God. And so, let's put God where God belongs. Probably on the way to the dump, the heap. They also talk about a quest for, that there's a deep quest. Now, this is where we begin to find seeds. Taylor says there's a tremendous sense, a dominant sense in our contemporary secular age for authenticity, to live, to be your true self, to be who you're supposed to be, to stand on your own 2 feet. Now, it's an extended version of the turn to the self that began with who? Descartes or somebody turning to our own reasoning, our own capacities for reason, and so on. So this turn to the self, but it's not, Taylor says, it's not a turn to an autonomous self, it's a turn to what he calls a buffered self. And that the quest for authenticity becomes a kind of, buffered is his word for it, we kind of do it by ourselves, of ourselves, in a kind of a cocoon. You know that word? It's within a shell. We put the shell around ourselves because we're going to be the best part. But there is a real quest for authenticity there. There's an anti-institutionalism, apparently, in our post-contemporary society. A conviction that there are no meta-narratives. There's no one big story that explains everything all the time to everybody. There's no ultimate truth. There's many worldviews, many values. We're digital persons now. And somebody in the States just wrote a book about it called Alone Together, that we're constantly texting and twittering and emailing and LinkedIn and all the rest of it, and yet very often there's a deep loneliness running through the contemporary soul in spite of our IT and our communication technology. Now, I'm going to say, you see, we're better to be realistic about this because some of these also can become assets. Some of the weeds can become seeds. So what? We've no meta-narrative. Of course, the Christian faith, to claim that we're the only people that God has revealed God's self to, would contradict one of our great dogmas of our faith, the universality of God's love. So to claim that we're the only people among whom God has been active in revealing God's self, or we're the only ones for whom God has a saving will, it would contradict the universality of God's love. So in a sense, of course there's other great stories, but guess what? We've got a fantastic Christian story. It's the best story ever told. There was never a better story told than the Christian story. So it can, and then we realized that we could learn from people of other traditions. We could learn from other stories. And we have to learn from other stories and be enriched by them. Jesus says, when you want to pray, go into your room, close your door, and be quiet. I never knew how to do that until I met Thich Nhat Hanh, who taught me how to meditate. I'm deeply inspired. I have a Muslim friend, professor at Boston College, who faithfully follows the practice of zakat. And that means giving 2.5% of your capital, not of your income, but of your capital every year to the poor. Now, every time he tells me about that, I just say, huh. And when he kneels 5 times a day on his prayer mat, I often say, I bet I should raise my mind and heart to God more regularly throughout the day. In other words, I can learn from that. Now, I'm not going to buy a prayer mat and turn toward Mecca, but I can be inspired by it, confronted by it, learn from it. So the multiple worldviews and varieties and views and values can be an enrichment. And I do think there is a way to draw upon the contemporary information and communication technology that builds community. Because what we've to say back, I think as Christian people, what we've to say back to people trying to find authenticity as a buffered self, we've to say, we affirm your quest, we celebrate your quest, but guess what? It can't be done without a tradition of wisdom and a community to sustain you. It simply can't be done. And we have a wonderful tradition, spiritual tradition, of spiritual wisdom and a community of people moving along together. So we have to be able to recognize and spin the same way they've got this deep, enduring spiritual sense, according to all the sociologists. In many ways, Taylor is simply summarizing a deep, enduring spiritual sense and an openness to the mystical and the spiritual in ways that modernity did not have. I don't know about you, but the young people that I teach at my university, very often they tell me, they say, Professor, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. And you know my answer to that? I say, I think that's fantastic. I'm delighted that you're recognizing that you're spiritual. Because guess what? We've got a tremendous spirituality to offer you. Because what is Christian faith but a great spiritual wisdom for life? It's not just a religion or a church. It's ultimately a great spiritual wisdom for life. And I often say to these young people, you know what? You won't remain spiritual very long. You certainly won't flourish spiritually unless you're drawing upon some resource that's a little older and longer and broader than yourself. Because the self alone won't be able to generate the kind of spiritual wisdom you'll need for the high times and the low times, the wakes and the weddings and the wakes, and for the everyday of life. But there's great resources. There's extraordinary wisdom here. Now, it's in earthen vessels. Oh, my goodness, is it ever? And yet there's a fantastic treasury here that you can readily avail of. And in ways that will definitely encourage your authenticity. But you'll discover that it's in loving the neighbor as yourself. There's 3 legs to the great commandment. We always say, love God, love your neighbor, and we throw away as yourself. No, there's the third leg. We are commanded by God to love ourselves, to care for ourselves, to cherish ourselves, and to do the same thing for the neighbor. And that's how God wants us to love God. Because God doesn't need my love. But God will say to me at the end, I was hungry. He gave me to eat. I was thirsty. God won't say there was a hungry person one time and you fed them. No, God will say, I was hungry. I was thirsty. I was in prison, and so on. So God wants our love, but wants it as love for each other, and especially for those in need. And in many ways, if I can be so bold as a good Irish Catholic, this is what Pope Francis is doing in the consciousness of the world. It's extraordinary to see how people are responding to him. My Jewish neighbors across the street from me in Boston are as excited about Francis as I am. And all he's doing is kind of laying out the obvious stuff that Christian educators should be laying out before the world. This is a fantastic way to live your life. Imagine if I would faithfully follow the way modeled by Jesus of Nazareth. And he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Imagine if I would live the way. How faithful I would be, how hopeful I would be, how loving I would be, how compassionate, how just, how peaceable, how inclusive, how hospitable, how you name it. How happy. The Beatitudes, we've got in English, we translated the blessed are the poor in spirit, but makarios is the Greek word there. It's better translated as happy. Happy are the peaceful. Happy are those who hunger and thirst for justice. It's a great way to live our lives. There's no better way. So we have to be able to articulate this, persuade this, not as a threat, not as a false promise, not under coercion, always by invitation, always by persuasion. And I think it's possible. And there is this affinity for justice that a number of people have mentioned, a powerful source to build upon and to nurture and to confirm and to expand and even to challenge, because the resources are in the tradition to do that. And they're seeking for intimacy. This is another one that Taylor raises off, a tremendous seeking for intimacy. Now, this can often get misused, misplaced into irresponsible promiscuity and all kinds of things. I'm thinking especially of our young adults. But it's also a deep seeking of to be cherished, to be loved, to matter to another person to matter deeply. They're looking, and this is an old phrase from Aristotle, or they ultimately want friends for the good that is in them, friends for the good of each other, friends for the good of the world. They're not just looking for sexual gratification. There's a deeper hunger there. There's a deeper desire there. And if we can tap into it and direct it in life-giving ways, it can be a powerful source of spiritual nurture. And it's one of the things that Christians have probably done most poorly, the integration of sexuality and spirituality. And yet, there are seeds in the tradition and seeds in the culture that I think can make that possible. And we'll come back and comment on that a little while. And yet, you do have to wonder, can we get faith and life to fit? Can we bring life and faith? Because I think we have to bring faith and life together. Some of the statistics, at least in the United States, there are now, and I just give from my own tradition, the last Pew report indicated there are now 30 million people in the United States who describe themselves as former Catholics. 30 million. And there's about 74 to 75 million Protestants who describe themselves as former Christians. Now you wonder, what are we doing that is so effective in driving people away? I mean, we must be doing something. And I always think, it's better to bring people along than to drive them away. Isn't that a deep, profound insight? Aren't you glad Roon invited me all the way from Boston to give you such obvious wisdom? We've got to bring people along rather than drive them away. But our churches find ways to drive people away. And of the people who have left our churches in the United States, when they were interviewed as to why, 78% of them said because they don't see the relevance of the faith to their lives. Now that's enough to make any religious educator cry. Because we somehow have to connect it, integrate it, assimilate it, appropriate it with people's lives. If we just talk about the Blessed Trinity as a big, important Christian doctrine and don't talk about what it means for our lives, that this God of ours is a God of right and loving relationship, a triune loving relationship within God's self and always toward us, that God is this unconditional love toward each and every one of us, that God would have to stop being God to stop loving me, to stop loving you, to stop loving any one of us. Now, when we begin to talk, we can talk about the Blessed Trinity as religious educators and say, oh, they're very important. There's a mystery we can't explain. You know, and perichoresis and circumcision. You can get all kinds of your technical. You can take out your old theology notes from seminary or theologus or wherever and impress everybody with perichoresis. Remember that one? Or whatever. Or you can say, you know, this is an extraordinary. You can say the Trinity is a mystery we cannot explain. Or you can say, the Trinity is a mystery that explains everything. It explains everything about who our God is, and then how we are to live as a people of God. Because if God is a God, even within God's self, is a God of right and loving relationship, and we're made in the image and likeness of God, then the only way we will find freedom, the only way we will find truth, the only way we will find authenticity is somehow to try to live in right and loving relationships with God, yourself, others, and the world. And you'll never do it otherwise. There's no other way to live authentically than through right and loving relationships. Why? Because we're made in the image and likeness of that kind of a God. And so when you're teaching the Trinity, and I just picked that example because it's a classic example of an old dogma that we've taught, but we've done nothing or very little to integrate it with people's lives. So the dominant research was it has to somehow integrate, connect with, make sense to, be a resource for the ordinary and everyday hungers, desires, quests of people's lives. And if it's not doing that, then this generation will walk away. And probably they should. I think we have to appeal to the quest for authenticity, but to do that, we have to new apologetic for Christian faith. We have to persuade instead of coerce. And we begin to look for a new language then to do this, because this generation, and I'm talking again, I suppose, of youth and young adults primarily, but adults like ourselves, there's very little interest. Nobody's that interested in being saved or redeemed or justified. Now, these were, I'm not disparaging these terms. They're all powerful terms. They all meant a lot at a certain time. We fought wars over these words. But they just won't ring in our time. But is there another way to craft the story? Is there a better way to communicate it? Maybe liberation is a better one. And it's equally biblical. Equally biblical. You can find all of these. The humanization, maybe humanization is a better way to go about it, because he was eminently known as the human one. And all four Gospels, he refers them to himself. So no scholar would doubt that indeed it was his title for himself. What he meant by it and so on, and where he got it, Book of Daniel and all this kind of stuff, the debate. But that he used it of himself. He introduced himself to the world as the human one. And maybe that's really what he was, the human one, the ultimate human one. And then, of course, was so human that people began to believe that he was God, the divine presence in human history. But maybe humanization, maybe the possibility of flourishing. There's the gospel of this past Sunday in the Common Lectionary. I don't know if you follow a Common Lectionary here, but the Lutheran and Catholic Churches of the United States, we share the same Sunday Lectionary. This reading last Sunday, Good Shepherd, I came that you may have life and have it to the full. Well, is there a fullness of life possible in this way that he modeled, the like of which can't be found otherwhere? It has to enable people to be their best possible selves in right and loving relationship. In other words, I don't think a self-sufficient humanism is nearly as humanizing as a life lived in faith. For the high times, the low times, for every day. And why? And that shouldn't surprise us. Our old mythical stories that we know are not, that none of us would believe is literally true, and yet they're powerfully true. They're eminently true. They were made, now the one that God made, Genesis 1, made in the image and the likeness of our God. What a fantastic claim. Then the second one that we don't believe is literally true, of God fashioning Adam, a person of the earth. It's an inclusive term. It's not gender specific. It's gender inclusive. Adam, that God forms Adam out of the soil and then breathes the breath of God's own life into Adam. Genesis 2:7. And Adam becomes nephesh. Now, I'm not a great scripture scholar, but I have friends who are. And they say nephesh, you can't translate it. But it's something like alive with the life of God. That the blood coursing through our veins here this morning is a share in the divine life. We're divine beings. So it's not as if we're human beings who have a spirituality. It's more accurate to say we're spiritual beings who have a humanity. We're made in the image and likeness of God. So as Pascal put it so beautifully, there'll always be a God-shaped hollow in the human heart that nothing else can fill. But we have to find the ways to speak it, to preach it, to teach it, to render access to it, that people can begin to say, hey, this is what I'm looking for. This is what I need for life. This is what I need in order to find and become the kind of extraordinary person that I can be in the image and likeness of my God. We'll come back to that later. It's a challenging time. We're going to take our break. Let me get a few comments out of you. It's a challenging time for faith, but it's also a great time for faith. It's a great time, I think, for a chosen faith. So it won't be because we're Lutheran because, well, we grew up in Sweden, or we're Catholic because we grew up in Ireland, or we're whatever. It won't be just by enculturation or osmosis, as it once was. It'll have to be by conviction, by choice. And it'll have to integrate with people's lives. It'll have to. And I think there is a pedagogy that we can employ that is a little more likely to bring life to faith and faith to life. There is a pedagogy that's a little more likely, but I think it's imperative in this day and age, and of course that we would practice it, but then to end on a good Lutheran note, God's grace is always at high tide, but in fact, that's an old quote from an old Irish wisdom saying that there's an ebb to every tide, except the tide of God's grace. That God's effective love is always at work in our lives, and so it will always be. In other words, God, as I start to end where I started this conversation, God will be faithful. It's our side that's questionable. Take your pen and paper. We're going to go to a break in about 3-4 minutes. What are you thinking? We'll come back, take this up. Is there a possibility in this day and in this post-secular, and I was very superficial and cursory in my description of it. You've got yours. You've got very fine sociologists and anthropologists who do the analysis here in this context specifically. I'm coming out of a more North American literature, but nonetheless there's a great deal of similarity. But given our postmodern or our post-postmodern age, what do you see as the potential? What will it take to do effective educating in Christian faith for your time and place? What will it require? What does it ask of you? Write it down, please. Well, you've already started talking about it. You can do that as we go to our break. Give me a couple of responses. We'll pick this up when we come back after the break. I went a little bit over time. My apologies. Thoughts, comments, insights. What are you coming to see for yourself? That's what's important. What you come to see for yourself. Yourself. Thank you.
Yeah, we were talking about earlier that, and I think also after listening now that it's very hopeful that in Sweden culture, very many people say that I don't believe in the church, but I do believe in something.
Yeah.
And that something is that talks a lot about longing for love and longing for freedom and longing for God, I think. So I think that's very hopeful that believe in something, because we can listen to that and meet that and share our experience.
Marvelous. Marvelous. Thank you. Because all the longings, ultimately, are longing for God and can bring us to God. It's not as if some are bad and some are good and so on. It depends on your theological anthropology. But they can all be harnessed in ways that can bring us to God. And when they're properly fulfilled, they bring us to God. And when we fulfill our desire for God, we're more likely to fulfill all of our desires appropriately. Thank you. Lovely insight. Another insight, comment, what are you coming to see for yourself that you didn't see quite as clearly? Or maybe you'd forgotten? Or maybe I revived? Coming around? A couple more comments before. You're not going to coffee break until I get 2 more comments. Simply that. Yourself. Yes, thank you. Because they're taping this. So don't be apprehensive. But
I try to formulate this in English, but I have read the book Secular Age, and I think one discourse that you didn't take up was the discourse of Taylor's discourse about excarnations. Because I believe that the big challenge he's writing about is the incarnation of faith, the embodiment of faith.
yes.
Because we have gone from the incarnational faith to the universal faith, and that misses the body. The body of the church is a social body and a
Very
political
fine.
body.
Yes.
And I believe that's one of the things, the big challenge today.
Yes, great point. I'm glad you made it. No, I left out all kinds. There's 800 pages in Taylor, so I left out many things. But I'm glad you raised up that one. One more comment, perhaps. What do you think it's possible? Do you think? Yourself.
Well, something I've been thinking about since while we've been talking is that we tend to limit God to a certain function depending on the need that God fills in a certain age. And then as society changes, we tend to think that we don't need God because he doesn't fill that function anymore.
Yes.
So I think as the church, we need to show how big God is and lift up what's needed at the time, but still say God is way, way bigger
Yes.
than the church, than anything.
Great. Marvelous comment, yes. And Anselm was so insistent that there's always a God beyond God. No matter what we ever say, think, conceptualize about God, God is always more. And so the God beyond God, we have to remind people of that. Otherwise, our little God will be too small. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll regather. We'll take the next step. If this is where we are, then what faith should we be trying to share with it? Enjoy the break. We'll regather in about 10 minutes. You're very welcome. My pleasure. My pleasure. Now, I think I should turn this off. I don't know if I turned it off. Sorry, what's your name? Ulf. Oh, wonderful. At Uppsala? Oh, that's lovely. I'd love to come. I'd love to come.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, hör mig. Där har vi. Ja, där har vi.
Jaha, nu så är det hög tid att börja återsamlingen. Om ni inte ska missa resten. Hallå. Ni har redan blivit så totalt uppfyllda så ni behöver inget mera nu. Ja, det är inte lönt. Det är inte lönt att prata med de här nu. Jaha. Hello, we will start again. Vill ni vara med? Nej, de vill inte vara med längre. Hallå, jag har inget glas att plinga i, det brukar funka bra i den här sekulariserade tiden. Oh! Jaha, ja. Ja, men nu så har strömmen vänt här. Jaha, jag tror att medan ni tar så ska jag lämna en liten kort information. Ni kommer att få tillgång till det här som visas så småningom. Det finns på hemsidan redan en annan sak som ni kan också få. De här bibeltexterna som ni inte har fått alla, det räckte inte. De kommer också finnas utlagda på hemsidan så ni kan hämta ner dem där. Så de som jag tryckte fram, de räckte bara till hälften ungefär. Det var väldigt vad ni hör dåligt här. Ja, ni kommer att få de här presentationen tillgänglig på hemsidan. Och likaså bibeltexterna finns där så ni kan ladda ner det. Ja, det var vad jag ville säga nu. Ja, där är han. Ja. Yes.
Take over.
Yeah, he never can learn my name. Oh, yes, close.
Hello? Oh my goodness, yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Wonderful. Well, thank you for coming back, and thank you for your many helpful comments during the break time as well. Let me push on a little bit. What faith? What's the faith we're supposed to present? And make accessible. Give people ready access. We certainly shouldn't impose it. That's proselytizing. But we can evangelize it. The difference between evangelizing and proselytizing, evangelizing is telling people what you believe. Proselytizing is telling people what they should believe. But we're always entitled to evangelize, to share to educate, to represent, to lend ready access to our faith. Now, 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be ready to do that. Always be ready to share the faith, the hope that is in you. And then he adds, but do it with respect and reverence. Don't you love that? Don't impose it. Don't force it. Don't threaten it. Do it with respect and reverence. But what is this faith that we're to share? And I suppose, again, you'd say, that's Tom, that's such an obvious question. But I think it's terribly worth posing and reflecting on, at least for the next 45 minutes. Take your own pen and paper. What is the most cherished aspect of Christian faith that you would love to share with others? St. Augustine, in a beautiful little text called De Catechisandis Rudibus in the Catechesis of Country Folk, said that it all depends on the enthusiasm, and he used the word hilaritas, it was the Latin, on the hilarity of the teacher. What you're enthused about, that's likely what you will communicate most readily. So what about Christian faith are you most enthusiastic that you'd love to give to the world? Write it down. Then a second question, and the answer to the second question may be much the same as the answer to the first, but it can be different. What's your great guideline regarding what to teach? The scholars, scripture scholars especially, talk about a canon within the canon. That all of us have our own canon that we follow. Now, let me steal what's probably a canon for many of you. But for example, you can say, justice is my canon within the canon. So when I find a text or a symbol or a tradition or a practice that's contrary to justice, I just know that, hey, that's not what I'm going to teach. In fact, I'm going to teach to the contrary. Why? Because my guideline is justice, or whatever it might be. So when you come, because we're all hermeneutes. We're all constantly interpreting the Christian faith, but also interpreting our contemporary context. And then trying to constantly figure out, how can I get these two together? How can I bring life to faith, faith to life? And you have your guidelines for how to do that. How do you name yours? Write them down. Could you go back to your neighbor for 2 or 3 more minutes? Have a chat. What you're most passionate about and your great, great canon of faith. Whatever it might be. Have a chat. I normally join a group, but then you won't be able to speak in Swedish. So go ahead, work away, and we'll regather in about 3 minutes. take another half a minute. We'll come back together. Well, we'll regather for a little while. You'll be back with your neighbor again in a little bit. I'd love to hear just as a gift, some gifts of your own wisdom about these questions. What is it what do you most cherish about this tradition? And then what's your great guideline of what to teach in the context of life? Let's hear a little of the wisdom from among us. Anybody give us a gift? Yourself, thank you. I think microphone maybe. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think that the greatest gift is that I and you and everyone, that we are created to the image of God, to the image of a loving God, who also, how to express it, that I am created to be loved and to be able to love.
Yes.
And in that I am the image of God, and that I can meet that in other people, and that we can meet and have a relation in that.
Sure.
That is, I think, the most cherished aspect
Fantastic.
that I have.
Yeah, it's breathtaking to believe all that. Yeah. Thank you. Beautiful. Another gift?
I think that Christ is there.
Will we take, maybe I'll get the microphone. If you be told, do you mind for a moment? Thank you.
I think that Christ is there, always there when you meet some other person, real meet.
When you meet another person?
Yeah.
Yeah. In the
Always there.
All right, wonderful. I think you're right. Another one? You want to say something? Thank you so much. Sorry.
I think that what I cherish the most is that he died on the cross for me.
All right.
And for everybody.
It's extraordinary to say that, yeah. That they put him to death. And then, pardon, he did it on our behalf.
I didn't say this to my group, but I say it now, that I like that God is dead, like Nietzsche said, but he's also risen.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And, the God of Nietzsche that died, we won't miss him. You know what I mean? There was a false God that died. And in a sense, we must move to the God beyond the God that Nietzsche proclaimed dead. Another one? Well, we'll be back to you in a little while. Let me make a proposal. Thank you. What faith are we to teach? Now, in a sense, there's an obvious answer, isn't there? I think we're to teach the whole faith. I think we're to teach the truths, the spiritual wisdom, the values that we find mediated through Scripture and through Christian tradition, that continues to interpret those Scriptures and to plumb the richness that was there always. Matthew 13:51, scribe learned in the rate of God. It's like the head of a household who continues to take from the storeroom, from the treasury, both the old and the new, because there'll always be horizons to our faith. It's not the same old to be repeated. It's a vibrant, living faith that continues to unfold. I always love his conversation with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. And he promises her that it will be living water, that it'll always be springing up, surging, gurgling up to eternal life. So it'll always have to be fresh water. And there's ways in which we've made it sound like stagnant, putrid water. Then, of course, that stuff kills. So there's a vibrancy to it. There has to be a newness and a life-givingness and an ongoingness and unfoldingness to it. I think we have to teach the whole story of Christian faith, but the vision of Christian faith as well. And it has to be crafted to people's lives. In other words, into their hearts, into their souls, into their, what Freire would call their generative themes, the stuff that really matters to them, the stuff that they're hungry about, the stuff they're scared about, the stuff they're joyful and excited about. It has to dip into the deep heart's core, as the poet William Butler Yeats put it. It has to reverberate in the deep heart's core, because it is ultimately a spirituality, not just a belief system for our minds. It is, of course, a great belief system, but ultimately it's for the deep heart's core. All the symbols, pardon me, of Christian faith, we to teach them all. And by symbols, I mean the verbal and all the ways that we congeal and express this story. All of it has to be made accessible, and what it means for people's lives, for the everyday of life. In other words, now sometimes in telling the story well, you also lay out the vision. But in my pedagogy, I constantly invite doing both and recommend doing both. That make it explicit what this story means for life and for us. That, yes, tell people that God loves them, but then that we have to love each other as ourselves. That God forgives us, yes, as we forgive those who trespass against us. The old stories of Exodus are not just old stories. They're a call to a people to live for freedom, to oppose injustice, to let slaves go free. Why? Because we claim to be a people of this God. Whatever you say about God, you have to say about God's people. So be very careful what you say about God, because it means that's for us as well. The notion of the story of the cross, yes, what a powerful story it is. And especially for people who are carrying a heavy cross, and for the people who feel marginalized by society, that this God, that, as Moltmann says, that we've got a crucified God. Talk about solidarity with those who suffer and those who carry that cross. And yet, always then with the story, yes, but God raised him up. I mean, it's a fantastic claim to make, that even death has lost its sting. And God raised him up not just for his sake, but for our sake. And that his rising, as Paul keeps repeating, is our rising. I mean, that's fantastic stuff. But then lay out what it means to live as a people of resurrection. Not just what the resurrection was all about. Teaching people about, we got to teach them about the resurrection. Of course we have to teach them about it, but get them to learn from it, get them to embrace it, get them to integrate it into their lives. That is our task. Anybody can teach about things. But that was the Enlightenment did a dreadful disservice. It did many great things. But when Immanuel Kant separated theoretical reason from practical reason, it led us astray. Because we thought, now you can teach people about the theory of things, and then hopefully, maybe, if it has any application, maybe they'll apply it. And we think that the scientific, rational, reasonable, measurable ways of knowing are the ways of knowing, because we can teach people all about that. But we bought into it, like as theologians, as church, we bought it hook, line, and sinker. That separation of the faith, in many ways, from life. And we make it sound as if simply it's a theory. To be understood. But after you've understood it, what do you do with it? So it has to be more than faith seeking understanding. But then you say, what should be our canon within the canon? Now at this point you're going to wonder why my friend Rune and Ulrika and friends that invited me to come, you're going to wonder why they invited me. Because I have something that's very obvious to say. I think the best thing we've got is Jesus Christ. Now, aren't you glad you invited me to say that? But, stay with me a moment. Jesus the Christ. As I said earlier at the beginning, there's a renewed sense of the centrality of the historical Jesus. And this, I think, is an enormously opportune moment for us. And here I make bold to quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, only because it has a powerful way of stating it. That the center of our faith is not the Bible. Sorry, good Lutherans. The center of our faith is not the church. Sorry, good Catholics. The center of our faith is not the commandments, the dogmas, the doctrines, the sacraments. Now, all of those are constitutive of our faith, central to our faith. But at the heart, we find a person, and this is the incarnate, this is the reincarnating. At the heart, we find a person, the person of Jesus of Nazareth. I love how the Catechism puts it, because we need both. The person of Jesus of Nazareth, the carpenter, the Jewish carpenter turned prophet, who took off for some unknown reason, probably to himself, leaving his poor mother probably unprovided for, because his dad was probably dead, and took off to his crazy person, maybe his cousin John, down at the Jordan, about 120 miles away. What was driving him? He had this deep sense that, didn't he stay at home? Loafing says this, didn't he stay at home and get married and have children like every other man in his village? What was it that drove him off? And yet we also believe he was the only son from the Father. We need the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And in some ways, we've done fair enough with the Christ of faith. The risen one that's there. But in a sense, the risen one, the Christ of faith has distracted us in certain ways from the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus, this Jewish carpenter, came preaching this inbreaking, the inbreaking now of God's reign of unconditional love for all. And isn't it interesting how he put it, that when we pray, thy kingdom come, the next prayer is thy will be done on earth. On earth. It's not just for later, as it is in heaven, but my goodness, heaven is not our concern. Now, my mother and father, I know they're doing God's will in heaven, but now is when it's to be done. Inviting radical love. This is why the unconditional love of God was why he could call for such a radical love from us, loving even enemies, doing good to those who hate us, going the extra mile, favoring the least, the lost, and the last, feeding the hungry. Only 2 miracles reported 6 times in the Gospels. The miracle of the resurrection, and the miracle of the loaves and fishes. In all 4 Gospels, and twice in Mark, and twice in Matthew. It must have been central to his public ministry, this feeding the hungry. And then when they came at him, this is lovely because he knew how to prioritize this faith. When they came after him for allowing, 2 Sundays ago, we had the reading, or it was 2 weeks ago, on a weekday, we had the reading of him allowing the disciples to pluck grain on the Sabbath. And when they come to him and say, you're breaking the Sabbath, he says, of course I'm breaking the Sabbath. These people are hungry. Now Jesus was not abandoning the Sabbath at all. But he's simply saying there's some things more important even than the Sabbath. In other words, get your priorities straight. There is a hierarchy of truths and values to this faith of ours. And our churches often get bogged down in not the major league truths or the minor league truths, but in the Pee-wee league truths. This is a baseball analogy that may pass you by. But the Pee-wee league is the little local league. And so often we make the Pee-wee stuff sound as if they're major league, and they're not. Inviting this radical love, fed the hungry, cured the sick, constantly expelled evil, confronted and expelled evil with the help of higher power. And then promised to be the fulfillment of the most radical text in the Hebrew Scriptures. Walter Brueggemann, a great New Old Testament scholar in the United States, says that in the synagogue at Nazareth, his home, when he comes, as was his custom, the Scripture says, he goes looking for. Now, the English translation we have is he found the text. Well, the Greek word there is heurisko, which means he looked for the text. So, and that wasn't just flipping through pages. He had to unroll a big mother of a text, of a scroll, and then looked, Brueggemann says, for the most radical text he could possibly find in the Hebrew Scriptures. There's no more radical text than Isaiah 61. That the Spirit of God was upon him, pardon me, and had anointed him to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and to proclaim God's year of jubilee, when debts are forgiven, when slaves are set free, when land is lays fallow, a jubilee of God's love and of God's reign breaking in, bursting in. Now is the time of fulfillment. Now is the time for God's reign. This extraordinary, and then welcomed all to the table. As I said earlier, I love Bolan Piasaki's painting, rendering. He calls it the Last Supper. Some people might object to that. What do you see up here? Tell me the obvious. The Last Supper, thank you. Men, women, and you probably can't see it too clearly. Children. Why were there too many? Was there really only the 12 and himself? Hard to believe. Throughout his public life, his table of fellowship was so inclusive. Hard to imagine him being up in Jerusalem at the Feast of Passover. I know it's debated, was it a Passover meal, but it certainly was in the context of the Passover time. It'd be very difficult to have him up in Jerusalem and get together for a meal and not have his mother, for example, present. She is there. She's at the foot of the cross the next day. Well, whether it's the Last Supper or any supper, doesn't really matter. The point of view is the radicalness of the life that he lived and that he modeled. And it's in many ways, as Christian educators, now we need let me finish out this. We need the Christ of faith as well, of course. The Christ of faith was indeed the Son within this triune God, and who, when Jesus says, whoever sees me sees the Father. So if we can't think infinity, and we can't, how do we get some sense of who God was? Today's gospel reading in the Common Lectionary says, I and the Father are one. Whoever sees me sees the Father. So what is our God like? We don't know. Ultimately, not fully, not completely. We don't have the language. And yet, we have this human face of God in Jesus. And so what Jesus was like is what God is like. Compassionate, merciful, inclusive, just, holding us responsible, holding us to the covenant, and yet empowering us to respond, loving us with God's abundant grace, as Paul puts it repeatedly, sustaining us, inviting us, yet not forcing us. And we believe that by his life, death, and resurrection, that everything has been changed. It's all been turned upside down. It's all been set free from sin, the power of it, powers of evil, social sin, even death has lost its sting. And that he rose for us, but he also rises with us and is with us always, he said, until the end of time. And then we find his presence, of course, through word, through sacrament, through community, still alive and with us. And then Paul says, by God's abundant grace in Jesus Christ, that it is possible for us to live now as disciples of the way, that it's not impossible. We'll never do it perfectly, but we can approximate. We can approximate living as disciples. You see, now, why am I on about this? Because I think, just to go back to the one of the historical Jesus, you see, I think, we're going forward there. I think we did okay with the Christ of faith, but the Jesus of history, many of our traditions missed out on it. And for good catechetical reasons. I have a friend in Boston who likes to play association of ideas around, just with football, with games, sports, politics. But when he does it with religious denominations, if he says United Church of Christ, at least in New England, people say congregational. When he says Baptist, people say Bible. When he says evangelical, people say Jesus. When he says Lutheran, people typically say Reformation. This is our context. When he says Catholic, people typically say church. Now, I think when people say Lutheran, people say Catholic, people say Christian, the first thought should be Jesus. Now, why isn't Jesus the central aspect of our consciousness about this faith? There's some reasons for it. For example, the old catechisms, including Luther's catechism. Luther, of course, wrote the first great popular catechism, the Short Catechism of 1529. But it's interesting, he put the commandments first, the sacrament second, and the creed third. Interesting, even having proclaimed the priority of faith, he put the sacraments first. When the Catholics wrote, they did the other way around, even though, so anyway, they weren't consistent in their positions, obviously. That's beside the point. The point is that he based the creed, he based the doctrines, the teachings of our faith through the Apostles' Creed. the unpacking of each verse of the Apostles' Creed. And of course the great Catholic Catechism, the Catechism of Trent, the Catechism of Baltimore, of Maynooth, and so on, did the very same thing. The old catechisms all favored the Apostles' Creed, and they simply took each article of the creed and then catechized it, taught it. But remember the creed. It says, born of the Virgin Mary, and the next line is, suffered under Pontius Pilate. In other words, we left out his life. We went from his birth to his death. The old catechisms of our faith, yours and mine, and all of ours together. Not a word about miracle of the loaves and fishes. Not a word about having women fully included in his central core group of disciples. Not a word about loving the enemy, doing good to those who hate us. Not a word about feeding, curing the lepers, curing the sick, reaching out to the marginalized. Not a word about it. In other words, in large part, we missed out on the historical Jesus. And I think this new historical scholarship gives us a renewed opportunity, put it that way, a new and renewed opportunity for recentering our gaze on Jesus. It's lovely when he does come into the synagogue, he reads that text from Isaiah, and then he says, today this text is fulfilled in your hearing. And then it says, and the eyes of all were fixed upon him. And I think that's the invitation of our time, to refix our eyes on Jesus. As the first now, then you have to say the rest as well, the Christ of faith, and you go on from there. So you can't fall into what the early Christians, was a heresy in the early Christian church called Christomonism, and many of you have studied it, where people began to think it's all Jesus. No, it's not all Jesus, but Jesus is our interpretive lens. Jesus is the canon within the canon of our faith. But he's the best apologist we can have for Christian faith. He lends a great persuasion. Now, Aristotle said that the best persuasion requires pathos, logos, and ethos. And we have to appeal to all three. Pathos is appealing to the deep human desires. And I think Jesus has the great possibility of doing that. People's desires for love, for freedom, for happiness, for truth, for mercy, for compassion, for a humane world. Jesus is the best apologist we've got for that. Likewise, logos means, well, it should be reasonable. It should be coherent. And with Jesus at the center, I think our faith makes eminent good sense, especially this Jesus of history. And then the Christ of faith, of course, because otherwise he simply lived and died. And then the discipleship to Jesus, the ethos, is the benefits that it leads to, the credibility of it from the benefits of it. And it is its own reward. I think when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, come follow me, he wasn't kidding. It'll bear the best of fruits, as I said, if I would ever so live, what an extraordinary life it would be. Then, now you can't just leave it with Jesus. Then we know God through Jesus is the ultimate loving mystery, and yet active among us to effect God's reign on earth. Jesus reveals God of love, compassion, justice, and peace in partnership with us, in partnership for us. God is love, and God is not only love, but God is in love with us, this triune loving community within God's self, always turned toward us, calling us then to so live. And you can go on, and we're going to run out of time and go to lunch, but sends the Spirit, ever present as God's grace. In other words, God's love is not off out there someplace. God's love is at work in the midst of the world. We call it grace. It's God's effective love outpouring in every life, moving in our hearts, moving in the ordinary and the everyday, enabling us to accept and respond to God's love that was made flesh in Jesus. This Spirit that calls us to a spirituality that puts faith to work through right and loving relationships with God, self, others, and creation. And then that triune God, of course, calls us into community, to be a Christian community that continues God's liberating work in Jesus Christ. In other words, you go on from Jesus to God, the Spirit, and the church, sustained by Scripture and tradition, by the sacraments, by the rich spiritual practices that come down to us. We need the whole story, the whole vision. So it's not just a little warm, fuzzy feeling between myself and Jesus. And yet there is a way to reprioritize this historical Jesus that in many ways our mainstream Christian churches at least have never done before. Not the way we could, not the way we should. And I still think it may be our best appeal. It may be our most persuasive apologetic into contemporary consciousness and people. What do you think? To put Jesus at the center of all Christian religious education, is there something here that we've got to reclaim? And if you were going to do it, how might you persuade people to at least learn from Jesus? We'll talk about this, and I talk about how to go about it, because you see, it's not enough learning about him, but we want them to at least learn from him. Even if they don't become card-carrying party members of the church. Now, I think there's a way to teach about, I think there's a way to inform people that forms them and could transform them, enable them to become disciples. I think there is a way to do that, but that it's not enough to learn about, but we have to do it in a way that can at least learn from him and maybe even become disciples. What might persuade or attract people to do that? I'm completing a large writing project in the United States. We're in book 8 of a new curriculum, a high school religion curriculum for the Catholic high schools of the United States. Some Lutheran schools are going to use it as well. Some Anglican schools are already using it. And so it's a huge project. It's been like 4 or 5 years, and working with my doctoral students especially. But we've piloted these texts with young people in various contexts, in some tough social situations and economically and otherwise difficult inner city parishes and schools, poor rural neighborhoods, and we've done it all around Jesus. Now, see, the old curriculum that we had was there was a book on Jesus, then there's a book on the church, then there's a book on the Bible, then there's a book on the sacraments, then there's a book on social justice. We've done a book on Jesus, then a book on Jesus and the church, Jesus and the sacraments, Jesus and ethics, Jesus and the Bible. And it's amazing. We've piloted in many contexts, and it's been enormously successful. And even with young people who are very jaded, turned off, couldn't care less, no interest, you start into the Good Samaritan or the prodigal father, or any of the great stories, and especially if you get them to bring their lives to them. If you don't start with the story, but start with their own story, and what they're bringing, and then have them read the text in light of their own lives, and then ask them what they're seeing for themselves, and what wisdom it might have, and would there be anything helpful in it for the ordinary and everyday. It's extraordinary what can happen. So, what do you think? Why don't you write a note? What are you thinking, in fact? Are you thinking anything at all still, since I've gone on and on here? Write down whatever insight, comment. What are you coming to see for yourself? Is there a possibility in recentering the historical Jesus without in any way neglecting the whole story? The Christ of faith, God, Spirit, church, sacraments, the whole Bible. They're all terribly important, but is there some potential here with the historical Jesus that perhaps could be a moment of opportunity? What do you think? Write it down. Well, why don't you go ahead and have a chat with your neighbor? Some people are starting to talk. Take 2 minutes with your neighbor, 3 minutes. What's the neighbor thinking? If you don't feel like talking to your neighbor, as I said, just be willing to listen to your neighbor. Then we'll hear a few comments and go to lunch. Take another minute. We come back together. Well, we don't want the soup to get cold. Let's, as I said, we don't want the soup to get cold. Let's hear a little of your own wisdom in response. What are you thinking? What are you coming to see for yourself? What's clarifying for you? Let's hear 4 or 5 people. Yourself at the back, thank you. And there's a microphone there, thank you.
För mig är det viktigt att Jesus är människa. Oh, I take it in English.
No, it's good.
No,
do it
that's
in
fine.
Spanish. Somebody will translate.
No, that's fine. I just didn't think about it. I work with English all the time.
Okay.
To me, it's really important that Jesus is human, so I'm very happy for you.
He's human.
Human, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, the perspective of that. And to me, it's also become more and more important to follow Jesus through the Gospels and to see that he's human also in the way that he changes.
Yes.
And he changes, he develops, he's not the perfect person.
Yeah.
He makes mistakes and he draws out of these mistakes.
Yes.
And when I talk about that, I realize that many people are provoked. I think we are so happy if we can keep God in a little box.
Yes.
And if Jesus is not in that box, then we really have problems. Then it's easier to talk about Christ as God, Christ as spiritual, and not the one that provokes me and so on. Yes. So I challenge myself all the time by thinking, Jesus is changing. What does that tell me?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's beautiful. And you see, I think we had an easier time believing in his divinity than in his humanity, in the fullness of his humanity. And the dogmas of our faith require us to believe both, and that they never compromised each other, that the divinity never suspended the humanity. That in other words, he wasn't lying there in the manger saying, "Ga, ga, ga," in Bethlehem, and then saying, "Wait till I grow up, you're going to be so surprised." He wasn't doing that. Nor was he just pretending to be there on that cross. He was there. So the divinity never suspended the humanity. So then you ask, where did he learn? Where did he learn? Where did he get such a radical sense of love, to love even enemies, to go the extra mile, to turn the other cheek? Why did he know to include women? Why did he feed the hungry? Where did he get these values? Well, take a look at the Magnificat. His mother and father taught him, Joseph, Mary, a God who puts down the mighty from their thrones and raises up the lowly, who fills the hungry with good things, sends the rich away empty-handed, whose mercy endures forever, every generation. I mean, he had to get it where we all get it, in his context, in his environment. And I love your thought about he changed. I often wonder, if he lived to be 50, would he have toned it down a little bit, would it have been as radical that you got to leave everything, your mother, your father, and not even go bury your dad? And I think he would have matured. Don't report me to your bishop on that, because I think he might have nuanced it a little bit, maybe not. Maybe this is just wishful thinking on my part. But he grew. I'm going to end with this. And you see, when we humanize him, we humanize the whole opera. We humanize our whole faith when we humanize Jesus. I love this story, my favorite. We'll end with this before lunch. We'll hear some more comments when we come back, but I want to tell you this story. It's in Luke chapter 2, but it's not, I don't believe it, because it couldn't possibly have happened the way Luke describes it. It says they lost the kid. Now, they're gone a whole day's journey out of Jerusalem before they recognize that the child is missing. Can you imagine the real conversation that went on between Joseph and Mary when they discovered that the kid is missing for a day? You said he was going home with your people. I never said he was coming home with my people. You said he was, I should have, where were you? And then they go rushing back into Jerusalem looking for their lost son in a very dangerous city, their only child. And it's 2 days later. Now he's 3 days missing. The last place to look for him, because he's a 12-year-old boy, is in the temple. And they walk, according to Luke's gospel, Mary walks in, cool as a cucumber, and says, son, why have you done this to us? Your father and I have sought you with anxiety. Now, I'll put my life on it. That's not what happened. Can't you imagine Mary charging into the temple, which she never should have done as a woman, scooping him up in her arms, smothering him in hugs and kisses. Oh my God, are you all right? Did they do anything? Are you bleeding? Did you do anything to eat? Oh, Joseph, give him a hug. Oh my God, I love. And then I think he made a 12-year-old boy a remark. He says, Ma, you should have known where to look for me. Now, we're not told what happens next. But all the text says, I can imagine Mary getting so mad at that kid. If you ever do that, I'll swear to God, I'll kill you myself. I don't care whose son you are. I shouldn't say that. But then the very next line of the gospel is, and he went down to Nazareth and was obedient to them. I bet he was. That poor kid was so scared he didn't leave home again till he was 30 years of age. And then it says, and he grew. Now the English translation is, he grew in wisdom, age, and grace before God and all the people. He grew, as my friend says. Now, who grew him? Mary, Joseph, his family, his environment. He learned his scriptures. Now, he also, why did he leave home and so on and go off? Well, there was something going on in his life, but it happened on, see, we always think of, like the road to Caesarea Philippi, we think it was just a Sunday school lesson, and he's trying to guess, which one of you gets the right answer? Who do the people say that I am? Well, you're John the Baptist or one of the old prophets come back or something. Then he says, just but you, who do you say that I am? Now, I think he was genuinely asking his friends, because that's how we find out who we are in our community. He was genuinely asking them, saying, please help me. Who do you think I am? Because I have these extraordinary senses, intuitions that maybe I am the Messiah. And I think every time he healed somebody and then told them to keep it a secret, now the scripture scholars have spilled buckets of ink trying to explain the messianic secret. My best guess is that he was just scared. He didn't want people to know because he knew what could happen if they knew. And yet he grows into that identity. But I think he was genuinely asking the question, on the road to Caesarea Philippi. Who do you say that I am? We've always think that, well, it was all right, and then Peter got the right answer and he got made the Pope. That's what happens when you got all the right answers. You get made the Pope. You see? I know Lutherans don't agree with this, but then, of course, what Catholics usually stop reading Matthew 16 right there. Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Read on about 4 or 5 lines. He says, "Get behind me, Satan," he says to poor Peter. Oh, phew. And of course, Peter went out in the night and cried, didn't he, for his sins. Let's go to lunch. Thank you very much.